Hey guys, Jacob Dupre here. Today we're going to be talking about neo-soul chords, so the genre of music called neo-soul. So what is that? Well, that's your Jill Scott, Erykah Badu, D'Angelo, some Esperanza Spalding, some Robert Glasper, all the harmonies and the beautiful chords that are in that music. So the first chord that's super common in neo-soul is the minor 11, and that one's right here. So the song that I'm borrowing this from, I'm going to talk about Jill Scott's A Long Walk is the name of the song a lot, because that song, besides it being really cool, just shows a lot of features of neo-soul harmony all in one song. I almost could have done this presentation just with that song and still would have covered a lot of ground. So it starts with this chord right here and this specific voicing. So you have the root right here, B, then you have the flat 7. So remember, now we're in B, we're technically thinking about B major scale, right? So the natural 7 in a B major scale, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 would be A sharp. That would be the 7, but because it's a flat 7, we're lowering it by a half step, so we get A. You have B, root, then you have flat 7, the natural 9, which is like the second scale degree, the flat 3rd, which is D, and then the 11. So that's your minor 11 chord. You can already hear, even if you're kind of new to more colorful harmonies like this or neo-soul harmonies, you can hear how that sounds like something that would be from that style, right? It's just got that sound. It really, I think, is like the most sort of like essential chord type of this genre of music. And A Long Walk, the song that Jill Scott does, starts with this really cool 3-chord vamp that starts with 2 minor 11 chords, B minor 11, and then moves down to A minor 11. So you take that voicing and move it down by a whole step. So that sounds really cool, right? And that's actually a cool way to practice when you're trying to get these voicings on one of your fingers. And I like to say this a lot, is it doesn't matter how you're transposing it, if you're moving it by a step or minor 3rd or even just by half steps. You're training your fingers and your mind to get used to seeing that shape and moving it around, right? So I could keep going down whole steps like this. And even that chord, because it's such a cool voicing, sounds really cool moving down like that, right? So that could be your own tune right there. So that's the minor 11. It's a really important chord. The second chord to be aware of is a 7 sus 13, and really I could boil that down to a sus chord. So sus chords are very common. The basic idea of sus has to do with this 4th scale degree right here. So if you take a major triad, so that would be like it would be just written as C. If it was in a chord like this, it would say C. If it said C sus, you take the 3rd scale degree, and we can talk in C because we're in C. You have the 3rd E, and that sus means that the E now becomes F because it turns into a 4. So you'd have this chord, right? But you can also have C 7 sus, which means you would get the flat 7, which would be B flat. Right? So this chord is a little bit more complicated than just even a basic 7 sus. It's a sus 13 chord. There are some different names you could call this, but this one's really specific because it lets you know that, hey, it's a sus chord, which means it's going to have that 4th degree, but it also has the 13th in it, which in this case is the D sharp. So that chord sounds like this. And actually in A Long Walk, Jill Scott, those chords go to each other. So when we get to the F sharp 7 sus 13, it moves to this chord, moves to B minor 11. So hear how those move. We're going to talk about progressions a little bit more later, but just to give your ear a taste of that. So this chord basically, it's similar to this one where it has root and flat 7, and then it has the root again, and then the 9, which is G sharp, then the 4 or the 11, technically the 4 in this case I guess because it's sus, and then the 13, which is D sharp. And again, just so you know, the way to really understand this is to know your major scales. So I know that this is the F sharp major scale, these notes. So I know that in this mode, that if I have a lowered 7, I know that the F is going to be lowered a half step to E because it's a lowered 7, so it's down by a half step. So that's this chord, sus13. So really pretty kind of open sound, where this is like the minor 11's a little darker, right? And it's still a really cool, beautiful chord, but this has like a real lift to it, right? Okay, so that's the sus chord. So you also get major 9 and oftentimes sharp 11 added to that. So sometimes you'll get like in this case we have a C major 9 sharp 11. So that voicing is like this. And you'll see that all these voicings are kind of, they have a similar quality to them, right? They're all very colorful, they have a fair amount of dissonance in them, but this one is actually very dissonant because it has this interval in the bottom, which is actually called a major 7th, and that has a lot of tension in it, right? You put those two notes together, it's really tense, right? In that chord, it's actually simpler than the others. It's only got 4 notes, but you get the root, C, the natural 7, which is B, you get the 3rd, E, and then the sharp 11, which is technically the 4, but we're calling it 11 and sharping it, so that's why we're getting F sharp. And that's a really cool sound. That chord can also be fleshed out a little more. You could put the 13 on top of it, and remember in C, A is the 6 scale degree, but it's also the 13, so you could add the 13 above it. You could also add the 9 in it, which would be D, but is also the 2, remember that. And you remember, if you're trying to build these chords and understand what scale degrees, what extensions to use, you always should come back to this basic 1 through 7, those numbers, because if you know C is 1, you're like, well, I want to know the 9. Okay, well 9 is 2. Well, you can just go 1, 2, up the C major scale. It's like, oh, that's my 9. So if I want to add the 9 in the top of this voicing, I take this D and move it up. And you can practice inversions. You know, you can take these notes. Kind of sounds like a wind chime. So yeah, I always like to throw in these little ways to practice, because it's one thing just to show you all these chords, but you've got to be able to move them around and use them to your own liking, and you know, put them in your own music and be creative with your practice. Okay, so the next chord, which happens, actually the example I'm going to use is from an Erykah Badu song called On and On. And altered chords would be like this one right here. And I specifically mean altered dominant chords. So dominant, that means this type of chord, so a B7. And a dominant chord always has this flat 7 in it, right? So if it's a B7 chord, and you count up the B major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that 7th note is going to be lowered by a half step. So this would be your basic B7. But in this voicing, it's a B7, sharp 9, sharp 5. And because it has that altered 9 and 5th, that's why we call it an altered chord. So you have B7, sharp 9, sharp 5. So the bottom of the chord is very similar to all of these, in which the root and the 3rd and the 7 are typically somewhere in the bottom. A lot of times the root and the 7, especially in keyboard voicings, will be down here, because the root, the 3rd, and the 7 are really the most important parts of a chord. To say it simply, they're like the basic building blocks of the chord. They tell you its basic structure and quality, where a lot of these notes that are usually up in the top are more color notes. They affect the quality too, but it's like the cherry on top, right? So you have the B, the root down here, the 3rd, E flat, the lowered 7, like we talked about. Now you have the sharp 9, which is the same note as the flat 3, but we're not going to call it that because we already have a 3, but we're going to call it a sharp 9 because of where it is in the chord. And then we have the 5th in B would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but we're sharping it, so up a half step to G. And then the root again at the top. So this has the root spaced out by an octave, and then with this chord in between. And in the Erykah Badu song, the beginning vamp is just 2 chords. It's this chord going to like an E minor 13. And actually, those are the only 2 chords in like the whole song. It's just that loop, so it does like this. something to note about that song is that it's using a very basic progression in a lot of music called a 5-1, which we're going to again talk about on the other side of the board. We're going to talk about typical progressions that these chords go through in neo-soul. But that's what you're getting. You're getting an altered dominant chord that's going to a 1 chord, in this case a minor chord. This is a really cool voicing too. I probably should have included it up there, but it's a minor, so it's kind of like the B minor 11 where it has the 4th in it. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's E minor, so it has an A. So that's kind of like a E minor 11 with a 9 at the top, but it also has this 6th scale degree, which is like your 13, right? The 5th kind of chord is called chordal or modal voicings. Now, again, if you're a little new to this kind of advanced harmony, you might be like, well, what's chordal mean? Well, quart means 4, right? That usually invokes the number 4. So chordal chords are just that. It's built off fourths, off the interval we call a 4. And the easiest way to understand fourths, again, if we're just talking about the C major scale, if you go from C and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, well, the distance from C to F is a 4th. It's that simple. So on the keyboard you can see it too. 1, 2, 3, 4, that's a 4th. I could stack another 4th on top of that. Another one. I could go all the way up. Okay, so in chordal chords, this voicing that we have over here, I have called C sharp Phrygian. Ignore that word Phrygian if it freaks you out right now. We're going to get to that. But this voicing I call, is kind of like a chordal voicing because it has 4ths in it. It has that interval of a 4th. So if you take just the notes in it, you have C sharp, then B, your flat 7, then technically a flat 9, D natural, then E, your flat 3rd, then your flat 6, also called your flat 13, and you just take away that D for a second, and you take the root, the C sharp out, you get this, right? Now listen to this. So if you have any knowledge of interval training, you can hear musical intervals, you hear that those are all 4ths, right? And I can count up them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's why we call it chordal, because all those intervals are 4th. And actually, if you put the D back in this particular voicing, it's not this way, but if you take the D and put it up higher, you get another 4th. Right? So now that's a real chordal voicing right there. And then you add the C sharp in the bass, which isn't a 4th. But that's what gives it that sound. And when you add in that D, the chord has so much like dark tension in it, right? And what's giving it the tension is this. You don't know that's in there when you play like this. It sounds pretty, right? But when you just play the C sharp and the D, that's in there. That actually is in there. But there's a certain softness to this, but this note adds the tension. Right? And that's actually, that chord again occurs in Jill Scott's A Long Walk. Love that song. And it moves down to a really cool voicing where it goes from this, and then almost the only thing that moves is the bass note. But you can get this. So that, in that way, I'm moving from C sharp Phrygian to this C major 9 sharp 11 right there. How pretty that is? That tension is like released. It's like a breath of fresh air. Now, I also call it a modal voicing, and that word over there, Phrygian, is one of the modes of the major scale. So I'm not going to do a whole video on modes because that would make this take forever. But the basic idea of modes is the first mode in the major scale you can have is the major scale. You start the pattern on C, and that's a mode. So a mode is like a pattern from a scale, right? Well, if you start on D and you play D to D, well, that pattern's different now, right? And it's because you're taking the same sequence of notes from the major scale, starting on a different note, so you get a different pattern, right? So if you start on E, you get that pattern, F. So all those are like different scales, but we call them modes. Phrygian would be the one I played that's the 3rd mode of the major scale. So if you take any major scale, you start on the 3rd note and you work up, you get this. So that would be technically E Phrygian, but we have C sharp Phrygian, right? So that's these notes. If you want to understand, okay, well, so the modes of the major scale come from a root major scale. Well, what is it? Well, if Phrygian starts on the third note of a major scale, which is C sharp, well, if you count backwards from C sharp, so A is the 1, 3, 2, 1. So it's bass, it's the like root major scale of C sharp Phrygian is A major. But it's A major starting on C sharp. So it sounds like that. So you'll see that you could call this chord that because this voicing comes from notes from that mode. All those notes are in A major. Now that we've discussed these common chord types that are found in neo-soul, I should say a quick note about these chords. And any of you guys out there that have any experience in these type of harmonies, you know they come from jazz, right? So anybody that's interested in neo-soul, you definitely need to check out jazz music if you haven't, because I promise you all these people, Jill Scott, Erykah Badu, definitely Robert Glasper, because he is a huge jazz player, have all checked out jazz. The whole history of it, right? They know it. And so really, neo-soul is like kind of a marriage of jazz harmony and hip-hop. So now that you've learned some neo-soul chords, let's talk about some common chord progressions that are in neo-soul. One thing to note, and you may have noticed this when I played On and On, the Erykah Badu song, is that a lot of neo-soul have these very short looped progressions, right? So maybe just 1 or 2 chords, or maybe 3 chords. And it may have multiple sections, but each of those sections may only have 3 chords, and they may loop for a really, really long time. In the case of the Erykah Badu song, it's literally 2 chords the whole time. It's just one big vamp. A lot of times we call that in music a vamp or a loop. And it's not to say that the songs have less. I mean, they still have choruses and verses and pre-choruses like a lot of other pop songs, but the chords are just very simple. And the songs change a lot of times because of the orchestration and the singers. And there's a song Brown Sugar by D'Angelo has this really cool like layered vocal harmony that comes in, I believe on the chorus, and it makes it sound so different, even though that song is the same 4 chords pretty much over and over and over the whole time. So let's go into some common chord progressions. Now I mentioned before a progression called the 5-1. 5-1 is perhaps, I don't know if you were going to call it the pillar of chord progressions. It's the biggest, most famous progression that ever has existed. It's been around since classical music, and even before, probably composers before that period that you haven't even heard of, that I probably don't even really know. It's a very common progression, right? So in neo-soul, you don't usually just get a basic 5-1, which would be like G major to C major. You get more complex ones. But notice about this, if I take G7, which is like a dominant chord, so that's if you have G major, you have F sharp, is your 7 going down to flat 7, remember? So you have G7 going to C. When I play these chords in succession, you can hear how it wants to pull down, right? So you've got, so that F wants to go down to E. And the 5-1 has this feeling of being away and coming home, right? When C feels like home. Right? There's a pull, there's like a tension and a release there, right? Those progressions occur in neo-soul, and the first example you get is like a 7 altered. So we talked about altered dominant chords, altered chords, remember that, going to a 1. So Erykah Badu's On and On, like I said, that's a perfect example of a 5 to 1, and that whole song is based on that, this altered dominant chord going to a minor chord, so 5 to 1. So 5 to 1. And it's the same basic principle as this simple G7 going to C, but it's just a denser chord. Now there are other variations of that in D'Angelo's Brown Sugar. I talked to you about that. That whole album you should check all of that music out if you want to understand neo-soul, not just that song. But it is a great song, and it has a similar move, but it has what I won't go too deep into again is what we call, it is a tritone sub. So instead of a 5-1, you get a flat 2 going to 1, and we get F13 going to E minor 11. So that's another 5-1. Just like right? So you can hear the similar sort of away, home feel. You can also get a sus chord going to 1, and that happens in Jill Scott's A Long Walk. So you get this F sharp 7, sus 13, going to B minor 11. And we talked about both those voicings before. Those were both on the first page. So you get this F sharp 13, and then it goes to the B minor 11. So down here in this range. So that's another 5-to-1 motion. And that's something else to note. You may say, well, flat 2 isn't a 5. That's, I mean, even if you don't know music, you can say, well, no, that's a Roman numeral 2 and that's a Roman numeral 5. That doesn't make sense. But a 5-to-1 motion doesn't necessarily have to be a 5 chord, right? There's a lot of music that has 5-to-1 motion where you couldn't even call anything a 1. Like, you sometimes don't even know what 1 is because the key is a little ambiguous. But it's more about the feeling of the away and home, the tension and release. That's really the cornerstone of this progression. So that's one type. The second type you get a lot of times is what's called parallel motion. Now, we talked a little bit about that when I took that minor 11 chord and was moving it down in whole steps. So the reason why that's parallel motion is because I'm taking the same chord, the same voicing, taking it, it's just making it stable and just moving it down. So all the notes are staying the same distance apart, it's the same voicing, and it's just moving. So here it's moving in whole step. Going down, I could move it up in minor thirds. Or any interval I want, but that's what makes it parallel motion, is that chord that's moving together in one direction. And again, Jill Scott's A Long Walk, that song like has everything in it, starts with this kind of parallel motion. And we get the 13 chord. So there are definitely more examples of parallel motion in the neo-soul catalog or of songs. But that's just a really great example right there, a really clear one. So now we can also have movements by thirds, and I just kind of showed you that, right? So you could have a minor 11 chord that goes up by thirds. But it's not always the same chord that's moving up by that distance, right? It could be different chord types that are moving by, rather than the interval of a fourth or a fifth, like a lot of these 5-1 progressions are moving. This is 1 to 5 is a fifth. So that would be from like C to G. But if you go from C, if you then go from G to C upwards, that's a fourth. So 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you go down to C, that's 5. So, but it's the same. I'm going to the same note, right? Just different directions. So that's fourth and fifth. But you can have movements by thirds instead of fourths and fifths, like we call perfect intervals. So one great example of that, Robert Glasper, Gonna Be Alright. B flat major 7, going to G minor 7, going to E flat major 7, sharp 11. So that'll sound like this. First chord, the B flat, then going down to G minor 7, I'm going to add an 11 too, and then going down to E flat major 7, sharp 11. So this is the whole thing in context. Right, so the first chord, and when we say things are moving by thirds, we mean the root. And we're talking about the root. So the B flat goes down to G, so that's a minor third. And then the G goes down to E flat, which is a major third. So another example of that kind of movement, which is a little bit more colorful, something that makes this sound, you know, you might notice all those chords are moving and they don't really sound very dissonant from one another. There's not a whole lot of change going, and it's because all of these chords really stay in the kind of B flat major area, right? So if you take the notes in all these chords, they amount to the B flat major scale. They're all notes that are in that scale. So it sounds very, they all sound very alike to each other in a way. Now, in D'Angelo's Lady, this move from A flat to E, which is a major third, sounds more like a stark contrast because these don't share as many notes. These chords all share a lot of notes because they're based off the same scale, but these are a little bit different. So this progression, it starts on like a E flat 7 sus, and then goes to A flat minor 11, but then we get E major 7, and actually it's also a sharp 11. So you hear that move, so A flat minor 11 to E major 7 sharp 11. And they do share some notes, because if you take E flat minor 11, the scale that would go with that, if you took A flat minor, which would be kind of like a Dorian mode, and then you changed it to E, there is a note that changes in there. And simply by the fact that we're kind of setting up this E flat sort of mode, right? This sort of like E flat minor sound. And then that E natural, you know, that just changed things a little bit. That took us a little bit out of that sort of comfort zone we were in. Another great example where that happens, and actually I'll skip down to this progression because it's a really good example, is you get to E flat major 7 and you go to E minor 11. Wow, hear how different those are? You know, you can, even if you don't understand what I mean by changing keys, you can hear how there's a shift right there. Those chords, rather than these, hear how those sound, but hear how this sounds. So this is the circle of fifths. It's used to explain a lot of concepts in music theory, and it really helps you visualize how keys work and how they're distant from each other. So, talking about distant key centers, if you look at this wheel, literally the notes that are farther away from each other are the most distant. So C and G are going to have a lot of notes in common, right? Because they're only a fifth apart. So C, D, E, F, G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's a fifth. G to D is a fifth, D to A is a fifth. And all of these fifths that are really close to each other like this are shared a good bit of notes in common. But the farther away, so if we start at C, and the farther away you get, you're getting less and less notes that are in common with that first key. So F sharp shares almost no common notes with the key of C, right? And you can see on the keyboard, if I play C major 7, and then I go to F sharp major, you can even just see with all the black notes I'm playing that they don't share a lot of notes. So some progressions to show these key centers, moving from distant key centers. I'm going to use the same Robert Glasper song that I used up here, which is called Gonna Be Alright. It's a really cool song. And it has this progression, and it goes through these chords from B flat all the way down to that A7 sus13 over there, and then it repeats it with this chord changed the second time. So the first time you get this to G minor, E flat major 7 sharp 11, then to D minor 11. Now up to that point, up to here, we've pretty much just been in B flat major, right? Like I was saying before, that stays in one key. But then when we get to that D minor 11, there's a shift that happens, right? And it's kind of unexpected. Right? We don't expect that. And the reason why that, again, I'm talking about how you hear that change, is because there's some notes that those chords don't share in common. So if you take the, what would essentially be E flat Lydian, which is built off the B flat major scale, so that would be the E flat major, but then you go to D minor, so they don't share as many notes. These notes are changing. So the mode's changing. So that would be like we're going from B flat, and then we're going to like C, right? So the B flat, the E flat major 7 really borrows from B flat, the key of B flat, and the D minor 11 borrows from the key of C, from that mode. So you see those aren't very far apart. So you can hear the change. You can hear the notes they don't have in common, which gives it that color, but it's not that stark. Now, when you go to the repeated part, so when you repeat these chords, when we get to this part, the second time, we get an E minor 11 instead. So then listen to that. So this is going from E flat to D minor, now E flat to E minor. Now you can hear more of a change there because there's more notes they don't share in common, right? So if we take the B flat major scale, but we play on E flat, and then we go up to E minor 11, which would really give us like an E Dorian mode, You can see the notes that change. Right? So that's more stark of a change than before. Now, another really great example, which has an even further change on the wheel, is going to be in Jill Scott's A Long Walk. So again, of course, because that song is like, proves all my points. So remember that progression was B minor 11, A minor 11, and then to F sharp 7 sus 13. Now the move I want you to pay attention to that's changing between key centers is the A minor 11 going to F sharp 7 sus 13. So that's these two chords. Now you can really hear a stark change in there, and that's because A minor 11 really borrows from C major, right? And F sharp 7 sus 13 really borrows from the key of B, right? So if you take the C major scale and then you go to B, those don't share a lot of notes either. There's only two common tones there. So the E and the B. Where if I went from C to G major, those share a lot more notes in common because of how close they are on the wheel. But B is almost on the opposite side, right? So when you have those voicings in context, you can hear how that's such a change. And I actually would challenge you in a practice, and I was just doing this a second ago because it was a pretty good practice, is to take that progression, that A minor 11 to F sharp 7 sus, and try to move it around on the keyboard, move it in different keys. So I was doing a thing where I was moving up by whole steps. So all I was doing was going A, F sharp, B, C sharp, going up like that. So that would be the root notes that I'm playing. That's actually a really cool lick you can do if you want to. So that is your common chord progressions. And again, like I said before, I encourage you to take this information. Again, if some of you are new to these kind of advanced concepts, this will really take you a long time to internalize. And a lot of this theory, you might say, well, I play by ear, I don't want this theory. Well, that may be true, but I know for me when I started, this helped me get a handle on a lot of these voicings. And now when I play, I kind of don't always even think about this stuff that much. It still means something to me, and I can still explain it, and I still need it, and it's still how I built my knowledge. But eventually, it all just becomes about listening. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into neo-soul chords. Again, I know this was a lot of information, this was a lot of advanced concepts, but hopefully this was a very thorough lesson for you and gives you a lot to work on in your journey to building these chords and putting them into your vocabulary. I'm going to do a little piece now, a little fun little loop that I've come up with, and it's using a lot of these kind of chord types and a lot of the progressions that I taught you that are common in neo-soul. So I hope you enjoy this, and thanks for watching.
Up on me, you are all I need, you are my divine. Don't give up on me, you are all I need, you are my divine.